By the end of 1941, Britain had already been at war with Nazi Germany for 2 long years. Those were dark days and not much had gone right. The RAF's fighter pilots had heroically won the Battle of Britain and stopped the Germans from invading. But the fact was, Britain was fighting on the defensive and almost alone. Then, on the 7th of December 1941, something happened. That something was Pearl Harbor. Without warning and with no declaration of war, Japan, Germany's Axis ally, attacked the United States naval base there. That terrible attack took almost 2,500 American lives. Pearl Harbor changed everything. It brought the U.S. into the war on the Allies' side. The most powerful nation on Earth brought with it men and machines and that famous, terrible resolve. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, Britain was invaded, not by Germans, but by thousands and thousands of young Americans from the U.S. 8th Air Force. They settled in bases mainly in the east of Britain, and that part of the country took a while to get over the shock. These ordinary guys looked different and sounded glamorous, and boy, were they popular with the ladies.
They were entirely different from the English boys being rather quiet, American boys being rather outspoken.
They thought Americans were so much better company. I mean, British men at the time were pretty dead lost when it came to courting.
The girls would always favour the boys in uniform, you know.
What we're about to tell you is an extraordinary tale of heroism and bravery, tragedy and love. I'm Michael Brandon, and this is the story of the American invasion. It may be 70 years since it was here, but all around this quiet English countryside, the deep links forged between the United States 8th Air Force and their British allies during the dark days of World War II are still to be found. In Connington, Cambridgeshire, Peterborough Business Airport is the host for a small select band of VIPs. Built in 1943, by the 809th U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and known as RAF Glatton during the war, these elderly men are proud veterans of the 457th Bomb Group. In their B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, the group completed 236 missions and dropped over 16,000 tons of bombs on Nazi-occupied Europe. 83 aircraft were lost, and 336 of their comrades killed or listed as missing in action.
We were running out of gas, and on the way back we had to get rid of everything into the channel, but we did have enough to get across.
What these men went through was the typical experience for the U.S. bomber groups scattered across this part of Britain. But how did they get to be fighting a war so far away from home? January 8th, 1942, a big day in the history of the U.S. Air Force and of the British Isles. That was the day the papers were signed, ordering the newly formed 8th Air Force to Britain.
A few last-minute instructions, and we're off. The compass points northeast. Pilots are impatient with the lack of sleep. Head up, boy. Pour on the coal. Let's get there. There's the base, 400 acres of dispersal areas. The RAF is on hand to welcome us. Set her down, Colonel, set her down. The 351st becomes part of the 8th Air Force. We've reached the battlefront. Simple, quiet names.
All these years later, it's almost impossible to imagine what these guys made of it all. They were very young indeed, 19, 20 years old, and here they were being whisked off to a foreign land to fight against a country that had become their enemy by accident. After all, Hitler wanted to keep the U.S. out of the war. He worried about what would happen if the Americans came in on the Allied side. Well, now he was about to find out. The Americans were stationed at bases mainly in the east of England, in counties such as Norfolk and Suffolk. Guys who came from big cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston suddenly found themselves in places such as Snetterton Heath, Thorpe Abbotts, Framlingham, and Wormingford. They also found themselves in Poddington, in the sleepy Bedfordshire countryside. The 92nd Bomber Group, one of the first American bomber groups to arrive, set up camp there on the 23rd of September, 1943. Shot by one of their medical team, William E. Doc Furness, this very rare color film provides us with a fascinating record of their time at the base. The U.S. 8th Air Force arrived in a country that had already taken one hell of a battering. The Luftwaffe pounded British towns and cities during the Blitz. Thousands were killed, millions of homes destroyed. These were hard times. Families had been broken up when young children were evacuated to the countryside to escape the bombing. Everyday essentials were rationed, things like meat, eggs, flour, and sugar. Clothing was also rationed. So was petrol.
Britain had been at war for more than 2 years, and it had already suffered the Blitz. So Britain was pretty shabby, it was pretty run down. There were large bomb sites all over the place, you know, properties were boarded up, you know, tarpaulins over things. There was rationing, of course, there was the blackout. It was certainly a nation at war, and it rather shocked a lot of American troops.
Of course, not everybody's experience was the same. While those in the cities had to contend with the bombing and the strict rationing, the freedom of the countryside and its natural resources helped make the war years that little more bearable for those living in rural areas.
Our house was a farmhouse, a typical farmhouse. And we used to have sides of bacon hanging up in our front room and hams on the wall.
Now, as farmers or small farmers in the village, we had plenty of fresh milk, eggs and butter. We made our own butter, and of course the Americans had tea, coffee and sugar, which we didn't have, and so there was a bartering system that went on.
Because living in the country, you had the rabbits to feed on. There was plenty of rabbits about. Well, I was wondering we ain't got twitching nose and long ears. The amount of rabbit pie we had, and rook pie, and such things as that.
It was all a world away from what they were used to. Their food and clothing and gas hadn't been rationed, and their towns and cities hadn't been bombed. Arriving in Little England with all its problems must have come as a mighty shock.
I knew nothing about the English culture except what I had read and what I had heard. No one traveled back in those days. No one left home to travel to any degree, especially going to another continent.
I really didn't have a pre-impression. I didn't really know what to expect, but I was pleased with what I saw, the overall friendliness of the people, despite some reports to the contrary.
I didn't know a doggone thing about England or anything at that particular time, and I still don't know much about it.
The U.S. authorities understood that young servicemen might have, well, problems adjusting to life in Britain. So to help them out, it created this handy little guide, Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain in 1942. Originally, this was a 6-page pamphlet. The author was unknown. But one thing was for sure. He was a shrewd little cookie. Quite apart from trying to help young Americans and prevent unfortunate misunderstandings, it gives a clear picture of how it was in Britain in 1942 and how other countries saw it. It tells them, for example, that The British do not know how to make a good cup of coffee. You don't know how to make a good cup of tea. It's an even swap. That might even still hold true today. It reminds them that British money is in pounds, shillings, and pence. They won't be pleased to hear you call it funny money. The British Tommy is especially touchy about the difference between his wages and yours. Naturally, you'll be interested to know about your opposite number, but you can understand that two actions on your part will slow up the friendship. They are swiping his girl and not appreciating what his army has been up against. Yes, and rubbing it in that you're better paid than he is.
Well, there are differences, that's true. For instance, we drive on the right side of the road, but in Britain...
Films were also used to help the young servicemen adapt to living in Britain. This one, called Know Your Ally, was made in 1944. 2 years on from the Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain pamphlet, it seems that the coffee hadn't improved much.
And anyone who ever drank coffee over there knows why there'll always be an England.
Is your coffee all right, sir?
It tried to ram into them that Britain was at war. Britain had been at war for 2 years. They mustn't come in here with a lot of bravado and bragado and sort of swaggering and, try to show the British what was what, because the British knew very well what was what, because they'd been at war for some time. So it was a very careful, trying to be an education about what they should and shouldn't do.
But of course, there were two sides to the story. It wasn't just the U.S. airmen who had to learn to fit in. Imagine the impact they had on the sleepy English villages of Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, Essex, and the like. If you were a young lady who had never ventured far from her home village, what were you going to make of a good-looking, well-dressed young U.S. airman strolling down your local street? And not just one, but dozens of them. No doubt about it. The American airmen became very popular indeed with the local female population.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. The American uniform at its best is very smart. We used to go to our local dance hall, and the girls would always favour the boys in uniform,
They treated girls like princesses, and they weren't used to that. They smelt nice, their uniforms were good quality, not the rough wool of the British soldiers. It was a complete turnaround. When we first met them, we thought they were rather brash, cheeky, as they would call now fresh, because they were entirely different from the English boys being rather quiet, American boys being rather outspoken. But the majority of them were quite fun.
But not everyone was quite so impressed. Local lads, that would be those in reserved occupations or unfit for active service, didn't stand much of a chance. Well, if you were an ordinary English lad up against a guy who's Hollywood-made flesh, how could you? Many mothers and fathers, especially fathers, they were suspicious. They reckoned they knew exactly what these young American men were after.
It was just amazing the number of servicemen that we had here. And the local girls were not that plentiful. So it did not create the best public relations experience, because there were so many more of the Americans here than there were British girls, and very few British men.
They had plenty of money, really, didn't they, compared to that? I think that's what made it so difficult for our boys, in a way, because Americans had to, had plenty of money, and they could indulge the girls with makeup and stockings and nylons and that sort of thing.
An American private would be paid 5 times what a British private was paid. The differential got narrower as you sort of went up the chain, but that's what it was. So of course, and a lot of these men were young. They had no families at home. They got paid their full amount, unlike, for example, the Canadians, who had some money deducted to save up for after the war. The Americans were given their full entitlement, and they tended to splash it around. So yes, the British were, I think, envious.
But don't run away with the idea that the Americans were living in the lap of luxury. Far from it. As these pictures show, home was the not very comfortable Nissan hut, basically a rectangular concrete base covered in corrugated steel. They were cheap, easy, and quick to put up.
We were in what at that time we called Quonset huts. I think later on they did come to call them Nissans. The entire Quonset hut, which I believe housed 4 officer crews, which would be a total of 16 people, had one wood-burning stove, and occasionally we could find a little bit of coal to put into it, but mostly it was wood-burning. And we were lucky to be able to keep it warm at night.
But the Americans were here to do a job, and that job was to join the British and hit back hard at Germany from the air.
Up until February 1942, RAF Bomber Command's strategy had been to try and hit specific military or industrial targets, munitions factories, naval installations, and the like. To be truthful, they hadn't been very successful. Someone worked out that only 1 in 5 aircraft managed to drop its bombs within 5 miles of its target. The cost in men and machines had been too high. Something had to change. The change came with the order to area bomb civilian targets. Having seen the devastating effects of fire during the Blitz, the RAF began to drop mainly incendiary bombs on Germany's own towns and cities.
So, what part would the Americans play in this great offensive? Well, they came to England committed to a campaign of precision bombing to be carried out in daylight. The champion of the strategy was General Ira Eaker.
All right, sir. Yeah, glad to see you.
The two Western allies, Britain and America, had different ideas about bombing. The Royal Air Force bombed Germany by night, whilst the United States Army Air Force bombed Germany and of course other targets in Nazi-occupied Europe by day. The British sort of went in for what was termed carpet bombing. The Americans went in more for precision bombing, which they felt they were able to do in the daylight raids.
To carry out the daylight raids, the 8th Air Force needed a great aircraft, and they had one. The famous B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. It became an icon of the war in the air. B-17s dropped more bombs on Germany than any other aircraft in World War II. It was able to fly high, to defend itself, and its ability to get home badly damaged gave it almost mythical status.
Oh, the B-17 was the greatest plane, in my opinion, that ever flew. So far as being able to withstand damage, and so far as being able to get you back home, it could do it. Many planes would come back on 2 or some 1 engine, and a lot of that has to do with the pilot, but by the same token, the B-17 was a very rugged plane. Everyone that ever flew on the B-17 will tell you the same thing.
The 17 at that time was the queen of the air, so far as all future flyers were concerned, particularly if you were headed for the bomber stream.
At Burtonwood, shiny new B-17s arrived from their transatlantic flights, ready to be pressed into service. Sometimes new planes were christened by one of the many traveling U.S. celebrities, but often there were no famous faces around to oblige. Enter stage left Dorothy Wood.
I was just working at my drawing board, and 2 Americans came in and said, you know, would you mind coming and christening in an aeroplane? And I said, no, I don't mind at all. And it all happened so quickly. You know, I was in the Jeep and driven up to the airplane, and of course the guy said, you know, don't break the bottle. so I didn't. A little bit of posing went on, and back to my drawing board, as if I did it every day. It was quite funny, really.
Great aircraft and a clear strategy with well-defined objectives, the 8th Air Force plan seemed to have plenty going for it. But what it didn't have was a fighter plane to give the B-17s long-range support. They had to fly over Germany without protection, and that made them a juicy target for the Luftwaffe, which got better and better at shooting them down.
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
There's one. He come out of the bomb bay.
Yeah, I see him.
There's a tail gunner coming out.
Watch out for fighters.
Though the Flying Fortress was called the Flying Fortress because it had so many protective guns, these weren't all that protective when it came to the skill and bravery, must be said, of the Luftwaffe pilots defending the Reich.
Well, all I know is that sometime during the war that we didn't lose a lot, but I wasn't dwelling on it because dwelling on it didn't do a bit of good.
As long as you kept your mind off of it, that you were not going to let it get the best of you, that you could stay with it.
I think most of us were so young and foolish that we were too much so to be frightened, and we just wanted to get on with our part of the war and finish up and get home.
Despite the terrible losses and the doubts expressed very loudly by the British here at Whitehall, the 8th Air Force continued their strategy of daytime bombing raids. For the locals living around U.S. air bases like Poddington, who were used to the peace and quiet of the countryside, the sight and sound of U.S. bomber squadrons heading for Nazi Europe was something they remember to this day.
The main thing what I always in my memory is the noises of the planes taking off and joining in with the other ones from Oxford and all shit things as that. But the roar of those engines, it's still in the back of your memory. I used to sit there hours watching and listen to the noise. I could hear them coming miles away.
The planes used to come out in the morning and then go round and round till they got in formation. And then they used to come back, tea time, they used to come past our house and you could almost see in the planes, propellers were not, going round, bullet holes in them. And then you'd see the flares go up at the airfield, ready for when the planes actually landed.
I can remember them going off in waves. That was quite a sight when they'd all grouped and went off, and the noise was just tremendous. They used to come back sort of piecemeal, one at a time, and sometimes there'd obviously a lot less came back than went.
It wasn't just the enemy fighters and the flak guns that worried the airmen. There was also the uncertain British weather, which sometimes brought its own very real and dangerous problems.
I recall several missions where we took off in fairly heavy fog, and then when we reach our assembly altitude, of course the pilot and the co-pilot, the navigator and the bombardier were busy searching to make sure that we were in the right place at the right time, and that the formation was shaping up the way it should. And every so often you'd see what I called a cherry bomb blossoming from the ground. And we all knew what that was. Some guy had blown up on takeoff. Probably the pilot becoming affected with vertigo, losing his sense of direction, altitude, whatever, and ended up crashing. And all of a sudden he's a firebomb.
Matters came to a head in October 1943. That was the day of the notorious Schweinfurt raid. The Bavarian town of Schweinfurt was the center of German ball bearing production. Ball bearings were vital, especially to German aviation, and it was reckoned that the factory at Schweinfurt was responsible for more than 40% of Germany's total production. They'd attacked it before, in August 1943. It had been a costly raid with losses running at almost 20%, but production in one plant was supposed to have fallen by 2/3 as a result. In those terms, the raid was deemed a success. Successful enough for the Americans to decide to do it all over again just 3 months later, on October 14, 1943. There was no avoiding the fact that morale among the crews at that time was low. They had already seen many comrades killed and planes lost, and the news that they were going back to Schweinfurt didn't exactly fill them with joy. After being told at the briefing that Schweinfurt was the target, one crewman said loudly, "Son of a bitch, this will be my last mission." Sadly, he was proved right.
They lost a lot of planes up there, and they never knew once they went out whether they would be coming back, and I would imagine they were sort of enjoying life while, you know, they'd got the chance, because it was dreadful how many they lost up there. 16 B-17 and 2 B-24 groups set out for Schweinfurt on Mission 115 that day. The Luftwaffe was waiting for them. The German fighters delayed their attacks until after the fighter support turned for home. And then they struck, knocking fully 2/3 of the U.S. aircraft out of the sky before they had even arrived over their target.
The casualties that they incurred in that raid were really probably out of all proportion to the amount of damage and the effect that the raid had.
Back at base, as more and more planes failed to return, it was obvious the second Schweinfurt raid had been a disaster. 2,900 men flew on the raid. 650 did not return. The 306th Bomb Group alone lost 100 men. 60 planes were lost. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. The losses of 26% gave the Schweinfurt raid the unwanted distinction of being the most costly 8th Air Force operation of the entire war.
Even with sort of improved bomb sites, and the Americans had the Norden bomb site, which was supposed to be such a great war winner when it was first developed. But I think that the RAF command thought that the Americans were being too optimistic in taking on these precision targets and knocking them out. And so it was deemed necessary for those flying fortresses and daylight raids to have long-range escort planes.
While the top brass argued about strategy and tactics, the ordinary U.S. aircrew had to just carry on, making the most of their new surroundings and enjoying their time not in action.
In the villages and the towns, the Americans soon found their way into the Great British Pub, which served great British beer. Sometimes this was a good combination, sometimes not. Mainly the locals and the Americans and the RAF boys rubbed along just fine. Other times weren't so good. Strong British beer does funny things to a man even if he's used to it. In the pubs in the larger towns, there were sometimes fights when guys had had a few too many. Maybe it was less of a problem in the smaller villages, where the landlord ruled with a rod of iron. Ah, the bicycle. The transport mode of choice for any upwardly mobile U.S. airman. A familiar sight on the airfields and country lanes of rural Britain. Bicycles were so popular, they were often acquired by fair means or foul.
If you got an old bicycle in the barn and you didn't want it, you could always sell it to one of these Americans, because it was a good form of transport on an aerodrome. A bicycle was, and they used to come down to village pubs and one thing and another. And on several occasions they'd come and they'd leave their bicycle in the pub yard and jump on the bus that took them into town.
They'd pinch bikes. That was the biggest problem, where they'd pinch a bike and go to Wellingborough, bike to Wellingborough, and sometimes they'd bring it back, and sometimes it didn't.
It wasn't all pubs, beer, and bikes, of course. Dances were very popular. There was one someplace on most nights of the week. They were also held on the air bases themselves, but with strictly no booze served. Well, not officially, anyway. But whether it was there or somewhere else, everybody got to dance to the bands of the day. Many were made up of servicemen themselves. They had names like the Fighter Comets, the Flying Eagles, and the Thunderbolts.
We used to dance a lot because that was our entertainment, and my husband didn't dance. So to teach him how to dance, it was quite a problem, but it was a challenge, so that was something interesting.
They used to have dances up at the airfield, and they used to bring the girls from the nearby towns in the lorries to these dances, but I never ever went to one of them.
A dance meant having to look your best. Easy for the U.S. Airmen in their snappy dress uniforms. But for the ladies in wartime ration-hit Britain, more imagination was needed.
Well, of course, there was clothes rationing as well as food rationing. And the problem was, if you had been fairly wealthy before the war and had a well-stocked wardrobe, you weren't too badly off. But if you'd been a typist or shop girl or something and probably didn't have all that many clothes, rationing hit you rather hard. So you'd have to be rather ingenious, you know, make do and mend. There weren't many nylons, it was silk stockings. And that's why the Americans were so prized, because they bought over nylons. And if they couldn't get nylons, girls were, you know, maybe they put gravy browning on their legs and, you know, draw a seam up the back or something like that. Cosmetics were in short supply too, so people again had to be very ingenious with things like beetroot juice and, you know, coal black and things. I mean, we're all told this. I'm never sure actually how much it actually happened. You know, melting down lipsticks to try and get the last little bit out.
I was fortunate in having a girlfriend whose mother was a dressmaker. So therefore, I was able to go out and buy materials, which didn't cost as much as clothing itself on the coupon-wise, and have a lot of outfits made through her, which was very nice. As for trying to lure, if you want to call it that, lure Americans, we just went to places where we could meet them and then enjoy having dances with them or having tea with them occasionally.
To local girls, all this must have all seemed like a dream. And to young airmen many miles from home, probably homesick and lonely, the perfect opportunity to forget all about it for a while. And who could blame them? If you're a flyer and ordered on a mission in broad daylight tomorrow, tonight may be your last. Are you going to turn your back on a chance for fun right here, right now? It's not hard to guess what sometimes happened. While some girls got walked home by airmen who had more arms than an octopus, others found their American escorts to be charm themselves, the perfect gentleman.
And there were a lot of girls who just, you know, just really liked the Americans. They loved the music. They thought Americans were so much better company. I mean, British men at the time were pretty dead lost when it came to courting. They'd take you out for an evening, they'd set you up with a drink, then they'd go with their mates and talk about, you know, cars or football or something. Whereas Americans had got courting off, you know, off to a fine art. You know, they'd take a girl out, they'd sit her down, they'd tell her she looked like Betty Grable or whatever. They'd buy her drinks and, you know, they'd compliment her. And it was wonderful. I mean, they might turn around and go and do exactly the same to another girl, but still, you know, it was a nice occasion.
The first time that I met Bob, my brother came round into the house and said, there's a Yank outside, wants to see you. So I went out, and from there we just sort of used to meet up. We used to go to the pub, used to go to my aunt's, and then we used to go to the pictures on the bus, 9p return.
I was at tea at this restaurant with a friend, and we happened to be sitting next to 3 American boys who seemed rather fresh and cheeky and winking and tried to make us girls, and we being proper English girls said, no way, you know. And then about a month afterwards, we were at the same restaurant, and in came my husband by himself and saw us sitting at the table and just came over and said, do you mind if I join you girls? And before we could say yes, no, or maybe, he plunked himself down and began talking with us and telling us about his life and asking us about ours. We began to date and eventually got married, and
had 3 children and 9 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren.
This kind of innocent fun was not always enough for a young, lonely U.S. airman. Not a problem. There was always a particular kind of British girl who was quite happy to dispense with any romantic formalities.
A trip to certain parts of London, and they weren't hard to find, would guarantee a meeting with a lady of the night, or of the day for that matter, nicknamed Piccadilly Commandos or Hyde Park Rangers. They offered their services in exchange for money, cigarettes, or nylons.
And it was not only professional prostitutes either. There were enough keen amateurs closer to the U.S. bases, or in some cases actually on it. The local magistrates took a dim view, though. Some girls were caught plying their trade on the bases and ended up doing a spell in jail.
Undoubtedly, getting a yank was quite something for a young girl. I mean, some of them obviously wanted romance and, you know, others, of course, there were prostitutes. I mean, prostitution shot up during the war. I mean, they weren't necessarily prostitutes, but they were certainly girls who would give, women who would give money for sex. And Americans were supposed to shine a torch on their ankles and decide who they would like to sort of go with.
I was aware of the fact that there were lots of girls hanging about. There used to be a dance hall in Warrington. And you know, you'd see girls coming out on the arms of Americans, and that's how it would meet.
Inevitably, there was a glut of unplanned pregnancies, not just among single girls, but many married women too.
A lot of the Americans that did come into the village, they did go with the married women. I mean, there were a lot of children. I had an aunt, and I mean, she had a land army girl live with her. And of course, she took the Americans there, the girl did. And then my aunt ended up with twins. And so, of course, their marriage ended.
Many of the Americans were befriended by households in the village. And my parents always did that. And I seem to recall that 1 or 2 of them never returned from some of their missions. And that was a sad time, but it was almost part of life. During their period on leave, they were major parts of the village and in the households. And my mother would probably do washing for them and things like that.
It was very exciting to have them there. And most days we'd got somebody in our house because they're sort of adopted families. We'd always got somebody there, and then they'd probably bring us some tinned fruit. And tinned fruit was a no-no, you just couldn't get it. And just exchanged for a little bit of hospitality, I suppose. I think it was like a big family. They sort of adopted everybody and enjoyed family life.
But back to the end of 1943, where the Americans are still counting the cost of the October 14th Schweinfurt raid, or Black Thursday as it came to be called. Whatever its effectiveness, there was no way the cost in lives and planes could be justified. Schweinfurt was something of a final straw. After that, U.S. High Command decided to suspend daylight bombing operations. The great unresolved problem was still the lack of fighter support over Germany itself. Once the current crop of short-range fighter escorts had to turn back on a mission, the Luftwaffe was able to zero in on the U.S. bomber aircraft, which only had machine guns to defend themselves. They weren't enough, and the casualty figures proved it. What was needed was a long-range fighter escort plane to provide the bombers with enough protection for them to be able to drop their bombs and have a decent chance of getting home. And they needed it fast. Luckily, they found a solution to the problem. It came in the shape of the Mustang P-51.
The Americans were desperate, really, for a defending fighter to ward off the Messerschmitt 109s and the Fokker-Wulfs when they attacked the Flying Fortresses and the Liberator bombers. And so the North American Mustang was such an important aircraft because with its extra fuel tanks, it could escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back again and engage those Luftwaffe pilots, fighter pilots, and defend the bombers. So it was, I would say, a war winner, but it contributed very much to the Allied victory.
So at last, the American bomber crews were going to be escorted all the way and back from their targets by the great new fighter plane. But the introduction of the Mustang P-51 was actually only part of the solution. The other part was how they were used. The Luftwaffe probably knew the time would come when the U.S. bombers would have total mission support and had planned a strategy to counter it. At first, they were pretty successful. They had their fighters massed in front of the U.S. bomber formations and attack as they passed through them. The German fighters had often done the damage before the Mustangs could get at them. That changed in early 1944, when General James Doolittle was made Lieutenant General of the 8th Air Force.
Doolittle's strategy of sending in the Mustangs, first of all, to encounter the approaching Luftwaffe fighters that are out to knock the bombers out of sight was a sort of tactic that he himself devised, rather than sort of just waiting for something to happen.
Doolittle decided to use the Mustangs not as defensive but as offensive weapons. In other words, he had them fly ahead of the bombers and attack the German fighter planes as they were forming up. The change in tactics brought remarkable results. There was a period of little more than a week when the Luftwaffe lost almost 20% of its fighter pilots, almost all victims of the Mustangs.
I don't think we could have survived without our little feathered buddy. They helped get us out of more scrapes than you could shake a stick at. The day that we went to Merseburg, November 2nd, our losses that day were due primarily to FW-190 German fighter aircraft attacks. And boy, did we love it when those P-51 showed up and drove them away from us. We were flying deputy lead, which put us on the right wing of the squadron leader. FW-190 came swooping in right into the middle of our squadron. As he pulled up and away, his right wing dipped and hit the left wing of the B-17, tore the right wing off of the 190, set the gas tanks open in the left wing of the B-17. And I watched the 17 for about a minute and a half. So at least 7 bodies come tumbling out. Of course, at that altitude, they would not have opened their chutes. And the FW-190 spun across the nose of my B-17, and he was moving so fast and so close to me, I couldn't get my guns on him. I finally waved him off because he was scratching and clawing to try to get his canopy open to where he could get out. So I finally says mentally to myself, "Go ahead, sucker, you've had all you need today."
Although the Germans were clearly now on the run, there was still a high price to be paid for final victory. For Betty Clayson, that fact hit home one awful day in September 1944.
On the 13th of September 1944, they went over a raid on Meersburg, and that's where they got shot down. And the plane crash-landed in Belgium, and Bob stayed behind to help his friend Richard, and they were all killed. After it didn't come down, I just sent a letter up to the airfield, and I just had a letter back with on the envelope, missing in action. He was 20, he was only 20. And his friend Richard, they're both on that photograph. And so that was the end of the romance.
Despite everything, the bombers kept returning to the big German cities, and they created havoc. Many had already been given a real pasting in 1943, but now the Allied planes were back with a vengeance.
I think the devastation of German cities, one only has to look at the newsreel film that was taken after Germany surrendered in May 1945, and you see these swoops by Allied aircraft over the cities, showing the absolute devastation. Whatever the merits of the rights and wrongs, the moral rights and wrongs of bombing Germany, Undoubtedly, it showed the German people that they were losing and had lost the war. It was effective from that point of view. It brought the war home to the German people, which the end of the First World War had never done.
It was now a question of when, and not if, Germany would be defeated. Hitler's war was now almost over. The Fuhrer had been desperate to keep the U.S. out of the war, for fear of what it might do. The 8th Air Force had played its part in proving he was right to be worried. The end finally came on April 25, 1945, when the 8th Air Force flew its last full-scale European mission. On that day, B-17s destroyed an armaments factory at Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, while B-24s smashed up the railway system close to Hitler's infamous mountain retreat in the German Bavarian Alps.
I think we really had mixed emotions in some of those final missions, because our typical mission was the lead squadron was at 25,000 feet, the high squadron at 25,500, and the low squadron at 24,500. And down with about a month, what turned out to be about a month left in the war, they started sending us in at 10,000 feet. And the first time they did that, we said they've lost their minds. But fortunately, by then, I guess the anti-aircraft people had been so decimated, the fighters had been so decimated, that the difference in altitude didn't seemingly make that much difference.
So it was all over. After almost 3 years, there would be no more missions and no more bombs. The 8th Air Force could pack up and go home, and the men in it need never come to England again unless they chose to. But there was, of course, one final chapter in the story. There were many airmen who met girls here and had fallen in love. They weren't after one-night stands or a fumble in a doorway for a pair of nylons. They wanted the English girls they'd met to be their wives. For infantrymen or aircrew, it was all the same. They were called GI brides.
Starting point, Waterloo Station, and at last the great trek is on. The first of 50,000 British wives of American servicemen, to say nothing of their 14,000 youngsters, are on their way to the new world. But the course of true love must be organized. So first to the reception area near Tidworth on Salisbury Plain, by special train, by very special train. And these are not just weekend farewells. The sadness of leaving home struggles with the joy of leaving for home, 3,000 to 6,000 miles away. The trek is on. Goodbye, dear old London.
About 60,000 women did marry GIs. Some of those marriages, of course, turned out to be lifelong and extremely happy. Others, of course, didn't work. I think a lot of women had very inflated ideas about America and thought it was all going to be a land of honey and, wonderful. And of course it wasn't. Some of the courtships were just so whirlwind that the couples hardly got to know each other. It always seems to me amazing that so many marriages did survive and were happy, rather than the reverse, that quite a lot, of course, broke up, either very soon or, just women just couldn't settle, or, they just found that when their husband on his home ground, he wasn't the man they'd known in Britain.
Well, we're all very pleased to be on our way. The organisation has been wonderful so far. We're all looking very much forward to getting to America and seeing Daddy again.
Well, I'm very happy now to be going to the United States, and I'm sure my friends here are. So far, I'm very happy and excited. It's very cold, and I hope it's a bit warmer over there.
The Army and their intelligence decided to ship us wives and their babies over on a very small commandeered. It used to be a German hospital ship, and after the war it was converted into cabins so it would hold women and babies. But they decided to send us over in the middle of February, and one does not travel over the ocean in the middle of February on a small ship if one can help it, you know, so it wasn't a very nice experience. But when we got to the other side, it was very different to see all these men who had been in uniforms, all waiting in New York in civilian clothes. So it was a little bit difficult to recognize them.
Nearly 70 years after they flew their final missions, the veterans of the 457th Bomber Group gather at the American Cemetery and Memorial Site at Mattingly, Cambridgeshire. They are here to join the Memorial Day service, which is held annually on the last Monday in May. This special day is when American servicemen and women of all ages remember and honor the American war dead. James Bass lays a wreath shaped in the distinctive markings of the 457th Bomber Group. And later, a B-17 Flying Fortress makes a flypast in homage to the fallen. Today, this corner of England is once again transformed into a little piece of America. For many veterans, this will be their last visit to England. It's a final opportunity to see the old haunts and pay their respects to the comrades who never made it home. In victory, they left a lasting legacy.
I do think about them, and I do think what a waste of young life. But we were fighting for our own freedom, and they come over and they helped us. So I'll always appreciate, and I'd never hear anything said against them.
The British people are very, very partial to us now because of what we did for them.
Many friendships were made, and they lasted for life.
I wouldn't give anything for the experience, but I sure wouldn't want to go through it again.
Well, I think in many ways it kind of modernised Britain. It showed the British that there was a wider horizons, and generally American culture permeated British society and left a residue which is probably still with us today.
More than 30,000 8th Air Force personnel were killed or went missing in action during the war. 30,000 more were made prisoner of war. 6,000 heavy bombers were shot down. 2,500 fighter planes were lost. 8th Air Force losses totaled more than those of the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy combined. Only 1 in 3 U.S. airmen survived the air battles over Europe. The average U.S. airman was just 20 years old. Nowadays, most of the airfields are gone, but there are dozens of small museums and collections dotted all over the east of England, all of them reminders of an extraordinary period in English and American history, and of the terrible sacrifices made not only by the men of the mighty 8th, but also by the RAF Bomber Command. It was, after all, together that they helped to defeat Hitler during the American invasion of Britain.